Welcome to part 2 of the screencast. If you have not seen part 1, please go ahead and watch it first. This is a continuation from part 1. In part 1, we demonstrated the testing and implementation of the get method and how to use query params as well as path variables to send data in with the request. For part 2, we'll look at the post method as well as how to use the request body to send data into the request. So starting with the code we have ended with in part 1, we want to change the test, the client to call a post rather than a get. And while it doesn't matter, we'll change the name of the method, and when we run it, of course it's not passing because we have a handler for the get method but not the post method. So let's change that. Okay, now we will rerun the test and now it passes. And yeah, we see that the params as well as the path variable are working just like before. Now let's move on to the annotation style. So we'll change this get mapping into a post mapping. And when we run the test, it passes as well. With the post method, we gain the ability to send in a request body when we make the request. So the simplest way to do this is to use a method, the body value method. And in this case, we are just going to say body value and give it some string. And when we run it, yes, it passes, but currently the handler doesn't do anything with it. So to in the annotation style, if we want to access this request body, we will use the annotation request body. And since we are passing this in as a string, we'll declare this as a string parameter. And we can now use this parameter, and we can, in this case, we'll just print it out. Okay, and with that set up, we'll run the test again. And if we look at the test printout, you can see that the request body is being passed in and received by the handler. Okay, now let's see how we do this in the functional style. In the functional style, we will extract this request body directly from the request. We would use the body to mono. We'll extract it as a mono of the type string. And we can then do a subscribe to it and to print it out. And again, we'll run the test. And you can see from the test output that we are receiving the request body. Now we return to the test, and let's say instead of just sending in a string, we want to send in a data object. So maybe we'll call this the request body. And the most generic way of setting out a request body is using a map. So in this case, we will set up a hash map of the type string, and with any any value, any type that it can map to. So we can then say request body, maybe an element called first is equal to the string first element. Okay, let's fix that. And a second second element, which is called second element. Now, when we run this, we find that it's still passing, and when we take a look at the output, you can see that it is actually converting it to a JSON string and sending it as a JSON string. So at the handler we are extracting it as a string, and the whole JSON string is presented. So let's say we, instead of using a JSON string, we want to receive this as a map. So we'll change the type specification in the body to mono, and this should give us a map, and we will we will extract this and print it out. So now running the test, we can see by looking at the output that is extracting it as a map. And for completeness, we'll also print out the second element. And again, that should work. Yes. Yeah, and looking at the output, we see that works. We'll now do the same for the annotation style. So let's comment the routes bin and uncomment the annotations style handler. And we need to change the type of the request body parameter to a map. And let's copy and paste this printing methods. And now running the tests, we find that it works. Next, I want to talk about how to make these handlers as robust as possible for the request body. So we want to be very lenient in how we receive the request body. So even if let's say some of the elements that we are expecting are missing, the handlers should not go into error. They should detect that and maybe know what to do. So if we remove one of the elements in the map, we see that it still handles it well. It just the value that's extracted is just null. Okay, so so that works in the annotation style. Let's see the behavior in the functional style. Okay, so it works the same in the functional style. So let's say we go a step further and we are making the same post call without the body value, okay, at all. In the functional style, this seems to work, but let's take a look at the output to see what's really happening. You can see that the printout for the request body values are missing. This is because when the request body is missing, body to mono will return an empty mono. And what that means is that it would complete without triggering any event, and none of the functions within this mono is will be run. So if you so your mono might just end without doing anything, and if you care about having some sort of the default behavior when there's no request body, you have to use something like switch if empty or something equivalent to inject a default value. So in this case, we are just injecting an empty hash map of the same type. And when we rerun this test, we see that now, looking at the output, we see that the functions that are in subscribe are triggered, and it's printing out the default value. Okay, and let's take a look at how we handle this in the annotation style. So for the annotation style, what you find is that you hit an error because it is expecting a request body. Okay. So we can try a few different ways to make this work. Let's say we make this an optional, okay, and we give it a default empty hash map. And now running the test, we find that this actually doesn't work. Okay, and I've not found a good way to make this work under the annotation style. You can probably use a kind of an exception, to capture this and return the right status, but there's not very much you can do. If you know a way to handle this, please let me know in the comments below. Instead of a map, we might want to use a class, some kind of a DTO, to give more type information to the request body. So let's say we define this as request DTO, and this will be a data class with two properties. Maybe we'll just call them first, which is a string, and second property, which is also a string. And now rerunning the test, we find that it's still not working. So what's wrong? This is because we have removed the second element from the test previously, And now by defining the DTO this way, the request DTO this way, we are actually explicitly expecting two properties in this in the request body. So in order to make it more robust, we'll change it to these two properties to be nullable. Okay, so so that's now working. Let's go to the functional style. And we'll change the body to mono to now expect request DTO instead of just a map. And we also change the default value that's in the switch if empty to something that might contain default 1, default 2, or even now if that's what you want to do. Now let's run the test again. And this passes without too much problem. Okay, now let's go back to the test, and we'll uncomment this line to make sure that we have the full request body that passes as well. And now that we have a request DTO, we can in fact use the same type to set up our test or client call. So we will say we'll construct the request DTO with the same strings as the property. So there's a first element as well as second element. And now when we run the test, we find that yeah, it's still working. Okay, and this is for the functional style. So besides body value, there are a few other ways that we can inject the data into this request body. One which is more flexible is something called just body, and it takes a publisher or a producer. We can simply have as a publisher mono or flux. Okay, so or if you want to do something more complicated, you can use something called a body inserter. Okay, so if I say body inserters dot from value, this is actually equivalent to the body value method that we've used before. So for the last part, I just want to touch on two other methods that data can be sent from the client to the request handler. So the first is through a cookie. So in this case, we are setting up the test to pass to set up a cookie that's called some cookie, as well as a header, which we will just call some header, and give it a value called header value and cookie value for the cookie. So this runs, but we also want to make sure that the handlers are seeing it. So now let's go to the handler. We start with the functional style one first, and again, the way that we extract the cookie and the header out of this is through the methods on the request. So in this case, we'll call request.cookies and give it an index. There's some cookie. Let's print that out. And now when we run it, let's take a look at the output. And we see that the cookie value is extracted. Okay. So now let's do the same for the header that we have injected into the request previously. So we'll call the headers method on request to extract the headers, and we would extract a particular header from it, which might be called some header. Now when we run this, let's take a look at the output. We see that we have the header value returned in an array. Okay. And we can do the same with put other methods like put and patch. So let's set that up. So instead of post, we might say that this route takes the method put, and when we run this, yep, it still works. Okay. Let's do it for the annotation style. So actually, the function name doesn't really matter, but I just want to change it for consistency's sake, and we'll change the annotation from post mapping to put. Okay, now let's modify this so that we are getting the header and the cookies into the handler itself. So again, we use an annotation. In this case, we'll call it request header. So request header would be a parameter of some header, okay, which is a string. We'll print this out. And let's run the test to see the output. And okay, that seems to work. And we notice a mistake here. We have been using the functional style. So let's comment out the routes bin so that the annotation style will be used. So let's run that. And yep, that passes. And let's take a look at the output. We see that the header value is successfully injected into this handler. So now let's take a look at the cookie value. So this is something we called some cookie previously. It's also a string, and we want to print it out in the same way. So when we run the test and taking a look at the output, we see that it is extracted in the same way. Okay, for the last part, let's try this out for the patch method. So we can change the annotation to a patch mapping and change the client's call to use patch. And in this case, we can see that it still works. Let's now do it for the functional style. So we'll comment out this handler and uncomment the routes bin. and we run this. We find that it's not working because we are still we are not handling the patch method yet. Okay, so let's change that, and that works. This brings us to the end of part 2 of the screencast. If you have any comments, please feel free to comment below. And if you find this helpful, please like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you.